So Boolean expressions come in very handy when writing conditionals, which are if, else statements. So we previously talked about flow of control. Java executes statements one by one in order that they're written, starting in the main method. But there are some things that can cause the program to jump from one place in your code to another. We've already seen one little example of that, which is method invocation. When you invoke a method, your current method is put on pause, and control jumps to that new method, executes that method line by line until the end of that method is reached, at which point control returns to the original method. Well, conditionals are another thing that can change the flow of control by basically giving you multiple paths that you can take, and you decide which path to take based on the conditions that are specified. So the very simplest form of a conditional statement is just an if statement. An if statement looks like this. We have the keyword if. Inside parentheses goes a Boolean expression. So that's, remember, an expression that evaluates to either true or false. And then we have brackets. Inside the brackets is some code. If this Boolean expression evaluates to true, the code inside here will be executed. If this evaluates to false, then this whole if block is jumped over and control will pick up in the next line of code after the if block. So this is an if block, sometimes called a conditional block or an if statement. And this is, again, your simplest form of conditional, just a single if. Now, note here that I have my nice brackets and indentation on my if statement. I put brackets surrounding the code that will be executed if the expression is true, and I have that code indented. Now, remember also that Java does not care about indentation. So if you don't indent your code that's inside of an if statement, Java won't care, but human readers really will. It's really important to try to stick with good indentation and good formatting when you're writing conditionals, because it makes your code so much easier to read and interpret by someone else. Now, if you leave the brackets off, which is allowed, but I am going to discourage you from doing that, but you can technically leave off the brackets after an if followed by a Boolean expression. And if you do that, what happens is that a single statement will execute. So whatever the one statement is after the if statement, that's what's going to be kind of tied with that if. And anything else after that is not going to be associated with the if. It'll be considered outside of the if. That doesn't matter if you indent it, right? So you can indent 10 lines of code underneath your if, but if you don't have brackets, only the first one is going to be associated with that if. Remember, because Java ignores indentation and only pays attention to brackets. So although that is a syntactically allowable thing, I'm going to encourage you not to do it. I'm going to encourage you to always use brackets as a good just habit to get into. And also it's good because you might think, oh, this is a really simple if statement. I just have a single line of code. But then later on, maybe you decide you want 2 lines of code and you put in the second line of code, but you forget to add the brackets. And that can be a tricky error to find. So I encourage you to always use brackets. I will always use brackets in my example. And I think it's good practice to just get into that habit right from the start. So the simple if statement is our most basic conditional. We also can have an if else. If else looks like this. We have the keyword if followed by a Boolean expression, open and close bracket. Then we have the keyword else, open and close bracket. Inside of each of those brackets are some statements. Okay. If the Boolean is true, the code here, so all the statement 1 code would be executed. And if the Boolean is false, all the code here inside the second set of brackets would be executed. So basically one of these statements will be executed, but never both, one or the other. So an if else is basically saying if something is true, we go down one path. If it's false, we go down the other. We definitely will go down one or the other. There's no way we'll go down both, and there's no way we'll go down neither. We will definitely go down one or the other. And then after the conditional, what happens is we pick right back up with the first line of code. So regardless of whether the Boolean is true and we execute the code in here, or the Boolean is false and we execute the code in here, when the code is done, we pick back up with the first line that is directly after the if else. Here's how it works if you don't have brackets without the if and the else, but I'm not even going to really focus on this because, again, I'm going to encourage you to always use brackets, but it works similarly in that if you don't use brackets, one line of code is associated with the if and one line of code is associated with the else. But I don't encourage you to do that. If-elses are what are called block statements. They're called block statements because they have these brackets. Anytime you're surrounding things in brackets, it creates what's called a block statement. What's important to know about block statements is that if you declare a variable inside of a block statement, that variable becomes local to that block statement. Remember that a local variable is, we usually use the term local variable to describe a variable declared inside of a method, and that variable is only visible within and accessible within the method. Well, the same is true of block statements. If you declare a variable inside a block statement, that variable is only visible and accessible inside the block statement, meaning inside the brackets. It can't be seen or used outside of the brackets. So if here I had some sort of if statement, and then I declared a Boolean variable inside my if statement block, if I tried to reference that variable outside, I'll get a compiler error because this variable only exists inside the block statement. Okay, so here's a couple simple examples of just our if-else structure. So here we have our Boolean expression using a relational operator. So if 7 is greater than -6 plus 2, is it? Yes, so this code here is going to be printed out. So yes will print. Here we have our Boolean expression that again uses an equality operator. So here we're comparing whether number 1 is unequal to number 2. Well, number 1 is 4, and then number 1 is reassigned to 4 times 2, which is 8. So number 1 is 8, number 2 is 8, and are they equal? They are equal, so note that even though number 1 is an int and number 2 is a double, they have the same value. The value of number 1 is 8, the value of number 2 is 8.0 because it's a double, but those are equivalent to each other, so this is going to evaluate to false. They are not unequal. And so what we'll print out is no. And then the next line of code immediately after the if-else block. So this will print no, moving on. Here we have another example. I encourage you to take a look at it and pause the video. Think for a minute what you think will print out. Okay, so here we have the use of a logical operator as well as some relational operators. So number 1 is initialized to 5 and number 2 is initialized to 10. So I'm just going to make some notes here, some shorthand. Okay, and then we say, is number 1 less than 10? It is, so this is true. Now note here the unadvised lack of brackets, but you might see that in other people's code. So because I don't have brackets, the one single statement that is after the if is what will be executed if this is true, and it is true. So number 1 is now going to be reassigned the value of number 1 times 3. So I'm just going to draw a little 15 in there. Is number 2 greater than 10? Nope, this is false. So this statement is never executed. And now we come down to here. Is number 1 less than 10? It's not. It's greater than 10. So this is false. Or is number 2 greater than 10? It's not. This is also false. A false or a false evaluates to false. So what is printed is no. And then the first line of code after the conditional. So this will print no. Moving on. Okay, here we have another example. Our number 1 is 1. Our number 2 is 10. Okay, is number 1 less than 10? It is. So number 1 is assigned the new value of number 1 times 3. Is number 2 greater than 10? It's not, so that this statement never gets evaluated. Is number 1 less than 10? This is true. So note that because this is true, we never even evaluate this. We don't have to because true or anything else is going to be true. So we never even have to look at this other side. And what will be printed out is yes. Okay, one final example here. Number 1 starts the same. Number 1 is 1. Number 2 is 10. Okay, is number 1 less than 10? It is. So number 1 gets reassigned to 3. Is number 2 greater than 10? Nope. So this statement never gets evaluated. Is number 1 less than 10? This is true. But because this is an and, we still need to evaluate this second half of the expression because we need to know both halves in order to evaluate the and if the first half is true. Is number 2 greater than 10? It's not. This is false. A true and a false gets evaluated to false, so this statement gets skipped and we evaluate what's inside the else, so this will print out no. So there is your some examples of your most basic if-else. Remember that with an if-else, you have the choice of two paths, and one of those two paths will always be executed, either the if or the else. When the if-else is complete, control picks up right at the very first statement after the if-else block.